this presentation, and thanks for Susanna and Oki and others for organizing this important event and providing us with this opportunity to meet each other, although remotely. But anyway, my aim in this talk to outline a phenomenological analysis of the act of participation, starting with the notions of Jean-Luc Nancy on that topic. This is how Jean-Luc continues to speak to me or whisper to me today, and this is how I continue to listen to him. The reason for this attempt derives from my long-term research, which has aimed to understand the nature and the conditions of the corporeal performance, the performance scenic transformation. Although my premises have been in the contemporary performance practice, philosophically, my conclusions have quite often come close to formulations that remind me of Nancy's thought of the corporeal coexistence, as well as the other ideas of his that I and my colleagues had become familiar with already during our study years in Strasbourg a long time ago. Later on, as an artist and artist researcher, I was used to thinking that artistic practice and artistic productions should not be based on any given ontology or highlighted. Instead, art should be regarded as an ontologically generative practice. However, in relation to Nancy's philosophy, that idea now caused a problem to me, both personally, theoretically, and practically. How should I relate my work that was very much written from the point of view of the performing artist? How does this work relate to the thought of this relates to the thought of this thinker, whose ontological orientation is so clear and distinct? It might be that my confusion around the matter was partly related to my superficial reading of Nancy, but it also brought up a question that I thought might have some originality and that I now want to share with you, namely concerning the distance and the tension that in Nancy's thought resides between the ethical or practical engagement and that mode of existence and experience that engagement should lead us to, and that Nancy describes in more ontological terms. To put it briefly, how to enter or access in practice the world of bodies, the mundus corpus, Nancy ends up to in his writings over again. And how could performing arts manifest and accomplish that entrance or access, given that our starting point both in art and in life resides in our everydayness? By formulating my problem that way, it led me to think about the act of participation, whose function and significance in the performative context is obvious, and which also reminds us immediately of certain motives in Nancy's thought. Could the phenomenon and concept of participation provide a simultaneously practical and theoretical link between the act of performing and the act of existence? This was my question that I wanted to study as I started to prepare this presentation. However, I was soon forced to notice that, unlike I had thought, Nancy actually speaks relatively little about participation per se. It does not constitute a philosophy for him, like, for instance, partage, sharing, that among the Nancian concepts comes perhaps the closest to what I had in mind, but it's still yet something different. The reason for this abstinence or reserve regarding the term in Nancy may explain itself on the basis of a few cases when that term actually occurs in his writings. As that happens, he often conceives it as a translation for the Greek term metexis, and at the same token, he juxtaposes it with another Greek term, namely mimesis. Both of these terms play, of course, a significant role in the Platonic philosophy, and having that in mind, Nancy wants to remind us that one should not be thought without another. Let me remind you about the passage in Le Partage des Voix, which contains one of the first references of Nancy to this conceptual couple. As you remember, that significant essay was devoted to the question of interpretation, hermeneia, and consisted of his readings of Heidegger's Sein und Zeit, alongside with Heidegger's later dialogue titled Gespräche über die Sprache, and of Plato's dialogue Ion. And I share the screen just to show you this first quote. Hermeneia, can you see it? You do. Hermeneia is mimesis. It is active, creative, or recreative mimesis. As a mimetic creation, it is accomplished by a mimesis that proceeds from metexis, from the participation itself caused by the communication of enthusiasm, unless mimesis is the condition of participation. So as my clumsy but very literal English translation. At the same occurrence in a footnote, Nancy reminds us about the French anthropologist and philosopher Lucien Lévy-Bruhl, who had used those two terms together to characterize the law of participation, as he calls it. According to Lévy-Bruhl, that law governed the logic of the mindset that he called a primitive mind, in distinction to a scientific mind. Lévy-Bruhl's theory is, from today's perspective, both ethnically and ethically questionable, and it was much criticized already in its times. Nancy must have been aware of that, and it may provide one reason for him not to address the question of participation more directly. He nevertheless wants to acknowledge his debt to Lévy-Bruhl as what comes to the mutual implication between participation and imitation that comes forth so distinctively in different kinds of magical or indigenous practices. If mimesis and metexis, according to Nancy, should always be taken and thought together, the two terms in question are susceptible also to make a subject for a potential debate between him and his closest colleague and long-term collaborator, Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe, whose philosophy was devoted to a study and the concept of and practice of mimesis. The affinity between the thinkers may also explain the extreme cautiousness by which Nancy approaches the issue in the passage I just quoted. Finally, what complicates any attempt to approach the question of participation philosophically, not only in Nancy's case, relates to its metaphysical burden in the post-Platonic and Christian philosophy, notably in Thomas d'Aquinas. The Saint Thomas adopted the term participatio from the Latin Vulgate, where it translates the Greek term koinonia, and he used the term participation to depict the relation of the created beings to the Creator, or the relation of the believers to the body of the Christ. In the Thomist ontology, the term participation always implied an idea of the whole and its parts. The participating beings were less perfect and therefore also deficient as compared to the perfectness and completeness of the divine existence of which those beings bore a reminiscence. And it is from this same legacy where Spinoza adopts the same term in his philosophy. Here, a few reasons why today we do not remember Jean-Luc Nancy as a philosopher of participation, and maybe you can come up with some other good reasons. Although the Greek term metexis, which consists etymologically of the two terms meta, in the middle of or between, and hexis, state or disposition, resonates strongly with many of Nancy's basic insights, and he acknowledges it by himself also in one occurrence at least. However, as we today use the term participation in social life, politics, or arts, we normally do not consider it against this historical, philosophical, or etymological background. For us, participation is most often a matter of decision and adherence, which sometimes, but not always, has an ethical sense, and which realizes itself in the form of different kinds of collective forms of collective actions that I now call generically as parties. This is how we meet the term, for instance, in Frank Popper's seminal study, Art, Action and Participation from 1975, devoted to the participatory art practices. However, and here is my whole point today, this discrepancy and tension between the practical, ethical, and everyday use of participation and its heavy philosophical bearing, Nancy included, makes it for us worthy of thinking, both as a term and a mode of action. To enter the analysis of this phenomenon and concept, I choose as my starting point a moment in Nancy's thought where he addresses the question of existential entrance or access most directly. The theme actually rises up in several Nancy's texts, but now I mainly refer to his essay La décision de l'existence in a collection of writings titled Une pensée finie, where Nancy analyzes the difficult Heideggerian notions of Entscheidung, decision, Erschlossenheit, disclosedness, and notably Entschlossenheit. The English translators of Sein und Zeit have translated the latter term as resoluteness, but according to Nancy, it should be understood according to its German idiom as a combination of decision and the act of disclosing or opening, as a decisive disclosure, if you like. According to Heidegger, Entschlossenheit implies Dasein's authentic being oneself, Selbstsein, and being in the world, in der Weltsein. And here's my second quote, and second and last quote today. Here we go. Entschlossenheit, and this is from Sein und Zeit. Entschlossenheit brings the self right into its current concernful being alongside with what is ready to hand, besorgende Sein bei Zuhandenehmen, and pushes it into solicitous being with others, fürsorgende Mitsein mit den anderen. Very complicated phrase, but you can imagine its importance to Nancy. As an event and an act of existential decision, it should be considered as a moment and as a movement, as a simultaneous transcendent and immanent transition through which Dasein shifts from the state of everydayness and existential forgetfulness to a state of more proper and authentic existence. As characterized by Nancy, we are dealing here with the modification between two modes of openness of Dasein, the first one consisting of the auto-opening of the everydayness, and then the second one of the on-the-opening of the Entschlossenheit. Okay, I now stop sharing. Now, if we think like Nancy proposes that we do that, what opens at that moment to a singular existing being is a world, a free dimension of the circulation of sense, and that this world is simultaneously a world of coexisting bodies, a mundus corpus. It implies that the body that simultaneously operates the changing question and constitutes its object, the body of Dasein, if you want, also undergoes a certain transformation. Insofar as this ethico-ontological act, the volitional act of transformative transition, is also susceptible of evoking both anxiety and joy, it undoubtedly has to have its corporeal correlate. But what does it consist of? That is what I'm asking now as I try to reconstruct the question of participation in the Nancian context. What legitimizes me to raise such a question is the evidence rising from the scenic practices, the affinity that resides between the volitional act of transformative transition, proper to existential decisions, and the decision every performer faces as they enter the scene, starts to play or perform in front of the others, the shift that they accomplish by means of a certain body techniques. All that happens before they start to perform the drama itself, which often also deals with people making fatal decisions. Although performers are used to accomplish this act as part of their profession, it does not cease to evoke certain tension and anguish them in the worst case stage fright. Every one of us has nevertheless undergone same type of processes and feelings in our life history and everyday life. In that respect, the action that a performer accomplishes while starting to perform only constitutes a special case of a more general and more everyday mode of bodily exposure of exposition, where a person enters a play or a game or any other participatory mode of exposition and brings their body in it. I will take as my guide the thesis of Nancy, according to which mimesis and metexis should always be discussed and taught together. If I try to think or imagine their mutual adherence, I quite unavoidably end up thinking and imagining a body. On the one hand, body seems to be the only instance imaginable where those two processes or actions can meet and coincide. On the other hand, those two processes are something that generate and modify bodies. Bodies have always some sort of likeness and feel. In other words, bodies are mimetic by nature. Bodies are also distinct, singular and plural, and they take and open a certain space around them. That space is never neutral either. As bodily spaces, they also have a certain likeness and a feel that changes alongside with the bodies that populate them. The world of bodies, mundus corpus, has at least these two aspects: the plurality of the bodies and the places and their corresponding sensibility. This is where the bodies belong, where they find and feel themselves and each other. However, that belonging is never anything substantial, posited, or given, but always chosen, produced, assumed, and that is why the state, insofar as it always plural and shared, can be considered from the point of view of participation as well, insofar it's always chosen, produced, assumed. Bodies participate in a world and thereby become its constituent parts. They belong to it. The world is both the object of participation and its starting point. Participation produces belonging, but only to the one who already belongs can belong to something else. The disposition or capacity, hexis, of participating is delegated to me as a part of my world. Correlatively, every time I participate in something within a world, my act implies a decision concerning the given world that sustains my participation. To which extent do I agree or disagree with it? But what does participation mean as an act, event, or experience? What happens to my body and to the bodies of the others at that moment? I already noticed that corporeal participation implies a certain transition and transformation. It's both mimetic and metectic operation. The finitely infinite mimetism of the human body that the art of acting has traditionally manifested constitutes a condition sine qua non for all participation, but it's not yet the sufficient one. In addition, like in the case of the actor, my participatory transformation is conditional in two other ways: that the concept and the phenomenon of the body gathers together. On the one hand, my participation is essentially partial. Only a part of me participates, and only in a biased way. So partial in two ways simultaneously. Psychologically, this fact may sound banal, but if we consider it at the bodily level, it turns out to seem much stranger. Just like in the case of Plato's Ion or in Diderot's Comedian, I can, while participating, still retain a certain internal distance to my participating part or side. Corporally, that same disposition implies that my body gets divided in time and space and according to their conditions. At the same time as one part of me participates, get involved or engaged, another part does not participate but withdraws from the given party. As a body, I can belong to any party only partially. This partiality is not dependent on my will or decision, but derives from the mimetic or metectic nature of my sensible body. The corporeal partiality of the participation enables as well that I can withdraw myself from any party, as well that I can belong to several parties at the same time. I can be free in relation to different parties. The bodily participation is therefore always multiple. Corporally, I can say I would prefer not to participate only by participating in something else. I participate simultaneously in many parties without needing to be aware about it. This is perhaps what the experience of belonging finally means. As I long for belonging, I'm missing a state of ease where I do not need to care for or think about my participation separately. The sustainability of the world, its everydayness, consists of this strata of this more or less conscious belonging. Insofar as my participation is partial, it requires from me a decision to participate, a consent or acquiescence that may also feel like a submission or sacrifice. At that moment, activity and passivity, spontaneity and receptivity merge in a peculiar but in a characteristic way. As I join a party, I shift a part of me, a part of my body, under the gathering power of the mimetic likeness and the conceptual determination that is common to the other bodies within that party. At the same time, I lose conditionally my self-determination regarding that part. It's still mine, but it's not anymore entirely in my command. It's exposed to the others in a manner that I cannot control in the same way as those parts of mine that do not participate and therefore remain outside the party. For the latter parts, the participation means a certain kind of restriction, whereas for the participating part undergoes a certain simplification or reduction. Even in the best case, when the participation finally enriches my life or saves it, it does not undo the state of dividedness it produces at the level of my bodily existence. For the same reason, the very moment of acquiescence is susceptible to provoke in me the kind of anguish whose relation to the anguish of existing is to be thought. But not anguish only. Just like Nancy underlines while speaking of the decision of existence, the same experience may also constitute a source of joy. As a body divides itself in a participatory way, it does not only suffer, it also enjoys, which fact also gives us much to think. On the basis of these few remarks, and to conclude, I come back to my initial hypothesis. No matter what is our actual life situation, the corporal experience of participation remains basically the same as in the arranged and artificial situation where you are called to participate in some performance, either as a spectator or a performer or as both. What one goes through in the experience of playing oneself in or bringing oneself into play, where one bodies turn partly into a stake, enjeu, or a cage at the mercy of the rules of the game. Affectively, the situation consists of a mixture of discomfort and temptation, a fear of shame and a hope for enjoyment. Insofar, this experience is identical with any other act of participation. The corporeal performance does not only represent participation, it also exercises it in the guise of a play or on the pretext of a fiction, as deprived from any actual or practical context, and therefore also in its purest and most existential form. Within that form, and through the anguish and the joy the participation evokes, our bodies become momentarily withdrawn from this world and from any world whatsoever, namely at the level of scenic participation, in order to wait our belonging to these worlds or world. Through this withdrawal, participation is revealed in its ontological power, in its capacity to make and establish the difference between being and the beings and the being, to start with one's own body and its belongings. For you, as readers of Nancy, this is, of course, not necessarily a big news. Instead, what these developments of mind now invites us to think consists of the following 4 short remarks. Corporally, decision of existence means participation. And participation implies partiality as a fundamental corporeal mode of existence. Every time as I decide to participate in something, no matter what, the idea of Nancy of mundus corpus as the idea of participation appears and withdraws itself like a flash, since that's the way the ideas appear, in passing. Insofar as participation is understood as a corporeal operation, this appearance is as unreachable as it is logically unavoidable. For the same reason, mundus corpus cannot be conceived as an ontology as such, but rather as a matrix for fashioning and conceiving different kind of ontologies, generating ontologies as fundamental combinations of being and language. Secondly, from the Nancian point of view, the ideas in which finite beings, according to Plato, participate and that they imitate are always also the ideas of participation, which means that in as much as the ideas call us to participate, the participating itself generates ideas, and every new idea implies a possibility of a new kind of corporal coexistence, including its mimetic and affective aspects. Thirdly, insofar as participation is partial by nature, then every party generates for its members not only a new mode of belonging, but also a new mode of not belonging. The everydayness conceives this not belonging dialectically as exclusion, as something not us, but the staging or mise en scène of this participation can reveal its existential structure, its very mode of withdrawing and bringing forth beings, and thereby its ethical relation to the world where it takes place or in relation to which it takes place. Fourth, if Nancy's thesis on the togetherness of mimesis and metaxis is taken for granted, then the Platonic critique of mimesis might be understood in a novel way. What the Greek philosopher criticized was not mimesis as such, but mimesis without metaxis, an imitation that deprives us the possibility of participating, taking part. In other words, simply the spectacle. Finally, it may be that the mimetic metactic body is the only thing that is truly given and entrusted to us, so that we would not cease to become it, to imitate it, and give its mode of existence to everything we can encounter and touch. Thank you, Jean-Luc, Nancy. Thanks for all of you.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions. Okay, yeah, Artemi.
Thank you. Very elucidating. But how would you respond then the initial question about the relationship of this theory to the theory of mimesis? How do metaxis and mimesis then finally correlate? Because much of what you said theoretically would apply to the mimetic behavior too. But, and then secondly, I also want to just, it's a comment. I think this is, the ontology you describe is very similar to what philosophically we can say of affects, of emotions. Sounds like a theory of effective existence to me. But that's just an aside.
My answer is very short. I think for me, Nancy is a thinker of the body, and it is this discovery. He has discovered a new concept of body corporality, and this mimetism and metaxis are just two sides of corporal existence. It is if we think about them together, we imagine a body unavoidably. I would state that it is simply so. And the emotionality has nothing to do with it. We are more on an affective level here. in an intercorporeal relations, according to which the bodies also take shape and conceive themselves in relation to each other.
Nidesh, want to?
Thanks very much, Esa. Always a pleasure to listen to you and to see you. I was fascinated by your articulation of mimesis and metaxis because, as you know, it's something that we have in common. We've talked about it many times. And so I was wondering, at some point you said that Nancy is treading a little bit carefully on the question of mimesis because of the proximity with La Coulabart. And I wanted to maybe link it back to what Auke was saying in the first paper, that what do you think about the role of La Coulabart and his thinking of mimesis in Nancy's understanding of participation, as if he's supplementing mimesis via metaxis while being in very close dialogue with La Coulabart, as you mentioned. So I was wondering if you could talk about where is treading carefully and what is at stake in this primacy of mimesis over metaxis. Mimesis allows metaxis, or vice versa, participation allowing mimesis.
Sorry if I repeat myself, but what lacks in Jean-Luc Philippe La Coulabart's philosophy is exactly the notion of the body, and it somehow like falls between those two thinkers. So it's more like a kind of delicate issue between those. So that if Nancy emphasizes more the metaxis, he criticizes La Coulabart. That's what he actually does. And I think the dialogues could be read from the point of view of this conceptual divide. And there has been, there is research on this. There's one doctoral thesis prepared on this topic. I can put it in the chat.